I found those background videos on Nepal interesting. There's a lot more resources and videos out there to try to understand the context there. I think from the videos related to the current local elections ongoing in the country, the connections to the conflict, human security, basic issues, I think it raises awareness of these challenges in certain parts of the country. But I mentioned earlier that Nepal was one of the countries with the highest levels of lack of knowledge about the challenges that the climate is facing within the country. Of course, there is a number of rather unique climate challenges to any developing country. With Nepal, and with the readings for this week, I assigned a reading talked about a couple of different regions within Nepal and how the conflict affected the resiliency and the abilities to people to adapt to changing circumstances. But it is going to be increasingly challenging for some of these countries, including developing ones like Nepal, to face higher costs of capital to be able to address these kind of changes. I think it's also really interesting with the Nepal case connected to larger geopolitics. Also, within the last week or two, the second international airport in Nepal actually opened in Lumbini, right near where the Buddha was born. The president of India came over to witness the opening of the major international airport, which was paid for by international actors, and through the kind of funding mechanisms that Nepal and other countries have to tap into, but it was built by a Chinese corporation. So they're going to face higher costs of capital, and they also face the challenge of rebuilding after an end of a conflict. A couple of interesting tidbits from the Nepali timeline that you might not be aware of. It was traditionally a hereditary rule by chief ministers that ended in 51. There was democratic elections right after the Cold War. The Congress Party won. They're also doing quite well in the current local elections, although they do share power with one of the communist parties. In 95, the Maoist revolt against the hereditary monarchy began. In 2001, the royal family was killed in a palace massacre by one of the princes, and there was a move towards ending the monarchy in the end of the peace deal in 2006. At the end of the war, there was an election to hold a constituent assembly to be able to pass a constitution. The Maoists won the election in 2008. They left the government in 2009. It was difficult to try to get policies implemented and deal with the reality of government. They left, but then, of course, they came back. In 2013, the Congress Party won the election without a majority. 2015, the huge destructive earthquake happened in 2015, which we touched a bit upon in the natural disaster week last week. Killed more than 8,000 people, magnitude 7.8 on the Richter scale. Not coincidentally, within several months after the natural disaster, finally a constitution was able to be passed, but like 7 years after the Constituent Assembly was actually formed. There was an election that led to a coalition government. The Maoists pulled out and then came back in, were elected as prime minister. The Maoist leader, Prachanda, was voted in. And the first kind of echo of accountability, I mentioned the Rwanda and the Kinshasa courts. That happened within a few years after the genocide, though in 2017 it took longer, but the first people who were convicted of a killing during the war from the government side were actually convicted in 2017. The natural disaster that hit the country in 2015, it had an unequal impact in different parts of the country, depending on where you were within the country. Nepal is roughly twice the size of Tasmania. To give you a sense of size, you see a clustering of casualties in the central part of the country. I showed last week a video of one of the central oldest parts of the Kathmandu Valley in Bhaktapur, really hard hit. The buildings collapsed. The earthquake is not the only kind of natural disaster that can hit the country. Floods and landslides are often ongoing concerns in both the reading as well as the videos that cause a number of different deaths, often clustered along in the southern part of the Terai, the lowlands area, less so in the mountains in the north or in the hill region in the middle part of the country. This is still something that continues to happen. What I think was really interesting about the case, and the reason why I assigned this article for a couple different reasons. One, to try to give a variety in the number of different cases that we talked to about natural disasters, climate change, and government's ability to respond. But it's one that connects to conflict in a country that faces challenges in reunifying after a civil conflict, as well as the perspectives of individuals that often get lost in the kind of large N comparative analyses that we've focused on in this class because of the large N kind of studies that dominate the conflict literature over the last 15 or 20 years. And I think this is really interesting, if a bit harsh for that kind of broad quantitative approach. There are some really interesting quantitative cases using quantitative articles using Nepal as a case study in looking at the violence in the conflict, the ethnic reasons for it, by Iyer and others. But I think this article is really interesting for the kind of methodology that they use. They use a qualitative methodology looking at these 3 different districts in the western part of Nepal. A lot of the videos that I could find about Nepal, a lot of them do happen in the Kathmandu Valley. In that corruption report, you actually do get some of that coverage down in Chitwan and the place a little bit east of where this is right here, but down in the lowlands in the Terai area. And in this report, they did several discussion groups, interviews with people in groups across these different regions, and they still kind of connected the challenges in facing climate change to similar kind of factors that we saw path diagrams from militaries, from researchers, the similar kind of overlap between political, economic, and security contexts, that in these different regions they had different exposure to violence during the conflict, and the readings talk about how those legacies can be important in some ways to reduce likelihood of conflict afterwards, the risk of it, but also potentially to make it worse. There are these different security challenges across them. But what I really think is interesting, both for the in-depth kind of discussion of the people and the findings that a lot of the aid provision could be ill-suited for long-term sustainability, like providing rice to certain areas like in the hills that don't normally grow them. They can become dependent on them and find it as a source of food that they might prefer, but it could be harder to sustain over the long term because they don't actually produce it. But also for the path diagrams. So in this article, they talked about, in their conceptual framework, the components of resilience. Right? The question for today is not just why the bad things can happen, but why not? What can people do to be able to respond to increase their resilience and reduce the effect of on human security and conflict? And they talk about livelihoods, justice, security, well-being, equity, and governance. And that can lead to, if it's strong, lead to good governments and institution that leads to a positive peace. Or if you have weak resilience, that could lead to bad governments and weak institutions, which could lead to violent conflict, which can have an effect of reducing their resilience to climate change and block mitigation and adaptation efforts that can have this circular kind of effect. And I think for me, the question is, with this theoretical approach, is where there's a lot of different needs: individual livelihoods, justice, security, well-being. Some of these things overlap potentially. I mean, all of them could theoretically overlap. You could write a paper on each one of these. But how do you prioritize? Do you prioritize individual livelihoods, national security, or justice for what happened previously or through inequities in previous years? connecting that to the interaction between the different adaptation measures. And the background is those kind of political or government actors through the provision of rights that I mentioned earlier, poverty reduction programs that were seen as having positive or negative effects on adaptive capacity and reducing vulnerability, or on climate potential. So you can see how you can think theoretically, interview individuals, but still try to think systematically about the larger patterns. And I think this article does a good way of trying to focus on the particular case, and then, kind of like Homer Dixon, think about what the larger patterns are and what's actually driving the policies having positive or negative impacts. Another effort that was kind of outside the scale of that article, but that I also think is really interesting and worth mentioning at a national level response to these kind of climate change effects, was the Nepal Climate Change Support Program. Went from 2013 to 2019. The program of action was really approved in 2010. The policy passed in 2011, in these years after the Constituent Assembly election, as the new government took office and relative stability was maintained through extensive funding of these kind of programs. In the article, it mentions the dependence of the GDP, foreign aid, is a huge percentage of the government budget. This project was aimed by and large on local level efforts, kind of like those activities and perspectives in the Transparency International video. So 20% at national level, 80% at the local level, 100 different local adaptive plans implemented in 14 different districts. There was a focus on gender equity in participation and management committee members, connecting to the national workshop activity from last week with the gender inequity of the COVID plans. Nepal is one of those areas that has put aside some assigned seats in the legislature for women. Historically unequal society across the genders after the end of the Civil War, as well as with the dependence on funding from international actors. You can make an argument that the international pressure helped implement some of these gendered issues in the behavior, and that's also having an effect on longer term impacts as more women go to school, benefit from these efforts, as potential longer term effects. And 50% of the participants also came from other traditionally excluded groups like lower caste members, the Dalits, and other disadvantaged communities, to try to recognize the systematic inequality across different groups in ways that hadn't been done before in trying to implement these kind of policies. Briefly, a few different types of these policies from this program, kind of showing links to the reading, in which there's a lot of needs in countries that lack the capacity. How do you prioritize the different kind of spendings? This was the best kind of quality graphic that I was able to find, and the colors are basically indistinguishable. I'll kind of take it from the top to the bottom as what most of the spending was on: agriculture, food security, livelihoods, forest and biodiversity, capacity development, climate-induced hazards, monitoring, water, and then infrastructure development. You can see that kind of relative priority in local level efforts that are funded by international actors. So you can see within the Nepali case, you have individual level programs that often depend on funding from international actors. To what extent that gives you autonomy or some kind of accountability is something for a discussion in the workshop. So then I'll turn to the conclusions now, briefly, connecting it back to the motivating question: how are national and local governments trying to mitigate or to adapt to the challenges that we've seen in this semester? I think in this class and today, I focus by defining our terms: mitigation, adaptation, and risk, something that the actors themselves take efforts to do in the governmental reports that we've read and that I referenced, and the readings themselves. You often have to define who the salient actors are. In the military, what agency, what part of it is tasked to respond to it: national governments, businesses, and individuals, right? There's different level groups. Developed countries have used a lot of mitigation efforts. I started talking about those, including cap and trade and carbon taxes. Adaptation efforts often include security concerns as people flow across borders, as the scarcity that we've talked about over the course of the semester increases. That can provide international potential threats to security as well as domestic ones connected to human security related to the Nepal example. And of course, like the Nepal example, developing countries face similar or much more extreme threats with higher risks with a lot fewer resources, often depending on international sources for those resources, as well as there's some innovative efforts at the local level. But as the Nepali case made clear, the national level parties' centralization can make it more difficult to have local level efforts that understand local contexts to be able to apply it to local level needs. So there's always this tension between national level or international level policies and what actually is necessary on the ground. And that could be in both research as well as with policy as well. So it's an ongoing challenge depending on how you define your terms, what your questions you ask, and what efforts you want to study. And with that, it is time to go to the workshop. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.